Montana Territory, winter of 1887. They called it the Great Die-Up, but before the cattle froze standing up in the fields, before the drifts buried cabins up to the chimneys, it was just a Tuesday in November that felt wrong. The air wasn't just cold. It was brittle. If you listened closely, you could hear the snapping of pine branches miles away, echoing like rifle shots across the valley. History remembers the tragedy, the thousands of head of cattle lost, the bankrupt ranchers who fled back east come spring. But history often forgets the anomalies. It overlooks the men who didn't fight the wind but learned to hide from it. In the high country, where the wind chill would soon drop to 60 below zero, a man named Thomas was standing in the middle of his barn, staring at the dirt. He wasn't a rich man. He didn't have the timber for a double-walled house or the money for a cast-iron stove the size of a locomotive. He was 60 years old, his joints grinding like mortar and pestle, and the town of Bannack had already written him off. They saw a man too old to chop the cords of wood required to survive a Montana winter. They saw a man who moved too slow. But they weren't looking at what Thomas was looking at. While the other ranchers were frantically insulating their walls, trying to keep the heat in, Thomas was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about where the heat came from. And he was watching the badgers. Days prior, he had watched a badger burrow into the side of a creek bank. The animal didn't look for a blanket. It looked for depth. It understood a fundamental law of physics that the ranchers in their clapboard houses had ignored. The earth is a battery. Thomas knelt on the hard-packed dirt floor of his barn, the air inside already hovering near freezing, and placed his hand against the ground. It was cool, yes, but it wasn't cold. Not like the air. It was steady. A constant, unwavering temperature that nature maintained regardless of the screaming wind above. This was the observation that would save his life. The crisis wasn't the lack of wood. The crisis was the architecture of the surface. To survive what was coming. A winter that the old-timers whispered would be the end of days. Thomas realized he couldn't build up. He had to build down. He had to invert the entire concept of a home. Stay with me, because what he was about to attempt was considered madness by every man who held a hammer in that valley. It wasn't just a cellar. It was a calculated engineering feat hidden beneath the very hooves of his horses. The physics of the situation were absolute. Above ground, the wind strips heat away faster than a wood stove can generate it. It's a losing battle against a convection oven of ice. But 6 feet down, the temperature stabilizes. The frost line in Montana cuts deep, but below it, the earth holds a steady 50 degrees, give or take. Thomas knew that if he could tap into that thermal mass, he wouldn't be fighting to heat a space from 0 to 60. He'd only be nudging it from 50 to 65. That is the difference between freezing to death and sleeping in your shirt sleeves. But the innovation required sweat. It required moving tons of earth by hand, in secret, while the rest of the valley was busy sealing cracks in their windows with rags. He chose the spot directly under the main stall of the barn. This was no accident. The barn provided the first layer of windbreak, a shield against the snow drifts. But more importantly, the barn was where the livestock would be. A horse generates a tremendous amount of body heat, thousands of BTUs an hour. By building his shelter directly beneath them, Thomas was creating a passive heating system, capturing the wasted energy of his animals to warm the soil above his head. The excavation began at night. He lit a single kerosene lantern, the flame sputtering in the draft, and struck the earth with a pickaxe. The ground was hard, packed down by decades of livestock, but once he broke the crust, the soil was loamy and workable. He wasn't just digging a hole, he was engineering a life support capsule. He dug a vertical shaft first, narrow and laddered, dropping 8 feet down. Then he began to widen the chamber. It had to be small. Efficiency dictates that you do not heat empty space, but it had to be livable. 10 feet by 10 feet. 100 square feet of sanctuary. The smell was distinct. Damp, ancient earth. The scent of a world untouched by the sun. He shored up the ceiling with thick beams of lodgepole pine, timber he had dragged down from the ridge months ago, seasoning in the shadows. He wasn't a carpenter by trade, but he understood load. He knew that the weight of a horse standing above could collapse a weak roof, so he spaced the beams tight, creating a ceiling that was more wood than dirt. He packed the gaps with straw and clay, a primitive composite that would insulate and seal. But the genius was in the airflow. A hole in the ground is just a grave if it doesn't breathe. Thomas understood that he needed oxygen, but he couldn't let the freezing air rush in unchecked. He built a cold sink at the entrance, a lower section of the floor near the ladder where the heavy, cold air would settle, trapping it away from the sleeping platform he raised on the opposite side. He fashioned a ventilation pipe from hollowed-out tin cans soldered together, running it up through the barn floor and hiding it inside a stack of hay bales. It was stealth engineering. To the casual observer, the barn looked exactly as it always had. A few horses shifting in their stalls, the smell of manure and hay, the wind rattling the siding. But 8 feet below, a transformation was taking place. A space was being carved out of the geology itself, a bedroom that belonged more to the logic of a hibernation den than a ranch house. While he dug, his hands blistered and bled, wrapping them in strips of flannel to keep gripping the shovel handle. He worked with a rhythm that defied his age.
Day, lift, toss. Day, lift, toss.
He moved 4 tons of earth in 3 weeks. He didn't do it for glory. He did it because he could feel the pressure dropping in his knees, the biological barometer that told him the world was about to turn white. The social rejection was immediate and harsh. You have to understand the culture of the territory in 1887. A man's worth was measured by his woodpile. A high woodpile meant you were a provider. A low woodpile meant you were a casualty waiting to happen. Thomas had stopped chopping wood weeks ago to focus on the excavation. When he went into town for supplies, nails, lamp oil, a sack of flour, the eyes of the community followed him. They were eyes filled with a mix of pity and contempt. Harlan, the owner of the largest cattle operation in the valley, was holding court at the general store. Harlan was a man of tradition, a man who believed that if a method worked for his grandfather, it was gospel. He saw Thomas buying oil instead of axe heads and scoffed. "You planning on burning the barn down to stay warm, Thomas?" Harlan asked, leaning against the counter, his voice carrying to the back of the room. The other men chuckled, the sound dry and nervous. They were scared of the winter too, and mocking Thomas made them feel prepared. "Just making some adjustments, Harlan," Thomas said quietly, placing his coins on the counter. He didn't look up. He didn't explain the thermal mass or the ventilation pipe. He knew that explaining physics to a man like Harlan was like trying to explain the ocean to a rock. "Adjustments," Harlan laughed, turning to Samuel, a younger rancher who usually shadowed Harlan's opinions but had a curious streak. "Did you hear that, Samuel? Thomas is adjusting. Looks like he's adjusting his way into a shallow grave. Ground's gonna be too frozen to bury you properly come January, old man." Samuel didn't laugh. He looked at Thomas, noticing the dirt under his fingernails, the strange, dark clay that didn't match the topsoil of the fields. "You digging a well, Thomas?" Samuel asked, his voice low. "Something like that," Thomas replied. He took his supplies and walked out. The wind caught the door as he opened it, slamming it against the frame, a preview of the violence to come. He left them to their woodpiles. He knew that wood runs out. The earth does not run out. By mid-December, the sky turned a color that had no name, a bruised, heavy gray that seemed to press down on the tops of the mountains. The birds had vanished. The silence in the valley was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a detonation. Thomas finished the interior of the bedroom. He lined the walls with burlap sacks to keep the dust down and built a small bunk suspended from the wall beams. He moved his essentials down: a case of tinned beans, a jug of water, his lantern, and a thick buffalo robe. It was tight, it was dark, and it was strange, but it was 52 degrees. Above him, the air temperature was dropping to 10 degrees. The contrast was already palpable. He could feel the warmth radiating from the soil walls, a gentle, consistent embrace. He spent his final day above ground securing the barn. He doubled the feed for the horses, ensuring their metabolic furnaces would run hot. He closed the shutters on his empty cabin, leaving it as a decoy for the wind. The skeptics were busy too. Harlan had his men out in the fields, driving cattle into ravines, trying to create natural windbreaks. They were shouting, whips cracking, fighting the animals and the elements with brute force. They were exhausted, their faces wrapped in wool, frost clinging to their eyelashes. They were playing the game by the old rules, man against nature, force against force. They didn't see Thomas walk into his barn and slide the heavy wooden hatch over the hole in the floor. They didn't see him cover the hatch with a layer of straw and manure, sealing the seam. They didn't know that while they were preparing to fight the storm, Thomas was preparing to disappear. The first flake didn't drift down. It was driven sideways, hard and fast, striking the wood like sand. Then came the drop. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. The blue norther had arrived. Inside the hidden bedroom, the sound of the storm was muffled, a distant, rhythmic thrumming like a heartbeat. Thomas lit his lantern. The flame burned steady and straight. He checked the thermometer he had hung on a root poking through the wall. 50 degrees. He sat on the bunk and exhaled. He could see his breath, but just barely. Up above, the world was ending. The wind was tearing shingles off roofs and driving snow through keyholes. Cattle were beginning to drift with the wind, walking blindly until they hit fences and piled up, freezing in standing waves. Harlan was likely in his parlor, feeding log after log into a stove that was glowing red, yet still feeling the draft snake around his ankles. Samuel was likely huddling with his family, watching the frost creep up the inside of the window pane. But Thomas? Thomas opened a tin of beans and leaned back against the earth. He was alone, buried, and invisible. The great test had begun, and the only weapon he had brought to the fight was a shovel. The days that followed blurred into a long, dark continuum. Above ground, the storm raged for 72 hours without pause. The snow didn't just fall. It scoured, filled the valley like a bowl. Drifts reached 20 feet, burying entire herds. The temperature hit 40 below, then 50 below. At those temperatures, metal becomes brittle and snaps. Spit freezes before it hits the ground. A man exposed for minutes loses his fingers. A man exposed for an hour loses his life. In the town, the woodpiles were dwindling. The frantic chopping had stopped because it was too cold to go outside. Families huddled in one room, burning furniture when the wood ran out, praying for the wind to stop. The fear was physical. It was a tight, cold knot in the stomach of the community. They thought of Thomas. Harlan, wrapped in 3 blankets, staring at the frost on his own walls, shook his head. "Old fool," he muttered to no one. "He's gone by now." Froze solid in that drafty shack. But under the barn, the physics held. The thermal mass of the earth, combined with the body heat of the horses directly above, created a microclimate. The temperature in the hidden room actually rose slightly as the snow piled up around the barn, insulating the foundation. It hovered at 55 degrees. Thomas could hear the horses shifting their weight, the muffled thud of hooves on the floorboards above his head. It was a comforting sound. It meant the engines were still running. He read by lantern light. He slept. He checked the ventilation pipe, clearing the small weep holes to ensure airflow. He wasn't comfortable in the way a man in a hotel is comfortable. It was damp and the air was heavy. But he was alive. And he was warm. He thought about the badger. He thought about the arrogance of building wooden boxes on the surface of a frozen planet. He realized that survival wasn't about fighting nature. It was about aligning with it. On the 4th day, the wind died. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. It was the silence of a deep freeze. The sun came out, blinding and cold, illuminating a landscape that had been erased. Fences were gone. Roads were gone. The valley was a smooth, white sheet. Slowly, tentatively, doors in the town creaked open. Men emerged like diverse surfacing for air, blinking against the glare. Smoke began to rise from chimneys, thin, desperate wisps. Samuel was the first to make his way toward Thomas's ranch. He trudged on snowshoes, his breath billowing in clouds. He expected to find a corpse. He expected to find the old man frozen in his bed. He wanted to pay his respects, perhaps out of guilt for the laughter in the store. He reached the property and saw the cabin. It was dark.
No smoke.
The windows were iced over from the inside. Samuel's heart sank. He turned toward the barn, thinking he should check the livestock, see if anything had survived. The barn doors were drifted shut, but Samuel managed to dig out the small side door. He pushed inside, bracing himself for the sight of frozen horses. Instead, he was hit with a wave of warmth. The horses were there, standing, breathing, their coats thick and fuzzy. And there, standing in the middle of the aisle, was Thomas. He was brushing a mare, humming a tune. He wore a simple wool shirt, no coat. He looked rested. He looked normal. Samuel stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth agape. The contrast was impossible to process. The rest of the valley was traumatized, frostbitten, and terrified. Thomas looked like he had just returned from a vacation. "Morning, Samuel," Thomas said, not looking up from his work. "Bit of a chill out there, isn't it?" Samuel took a step forward, pulling the scarf from his face. "Thomas? How? Where were you? The cabin is ice. We thought you were dead." Thomas stopped brushing. He walked over to the stall, kicked aside some fresh straw, and lifted the heavy wooden hatch. A plume of earthy, warm air rose up, visible in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the barn cracks. "I wasn't in the cabin," Thomas said. "Come take a look." Samuel peered down into the hole. He saw the lantern still burning, the bunk, the books, the dry earth walls. He felt the heat rising from the ground. It wasn't magic. It was engineering. It was the vindication of the quiet innovator. "The ground keeps you warm, Samuel," Thomas said softly. "You just have to trust it enough to get in." News traveled fast, even in deep snow. By noon, Harlan had arrived, riding a horse that was chest-deep in the drifts. He didn't come to mock. He came because he had lost 50 head of cattle and nearly lost his toes. He walked into the barn, saw the hatch, saw the room. He didn't say a word for a long time. He took off his glove and held his hand over the opening, feeling the 50-degree air. It was the thermometer moment. The data was undeniable. The physics didn't care about his tradition or his pride. The physics just worked. Harlan looked at Thomas, really looked at him for the first time in years. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary, stunned respect. "You beat it," Harlan whispered. "You beat the winter." "I didn't beat anything," Thomas replied, closing the hatch. "I just got out of the way. That winter changed the way they built in the valley. It changed the way they looked at the earth." Thomas didn't become the mayor. He didn't become rich. But he became the man they listened to. When the next winter approached, you could see the change. Men were banking dirt against their foundations. They were digging root cellars deeper. They were learning. Thomas lived another 20 years on that ranch, surviving winters that broke younger men. He left a legacy not of conquest, but of adaptation. And it all started with a hole in the ground and the wisdom to know that sometimes the only way to go forward is to go down.